Hello and welcome back to the Doctor Who Marathon. I'm your host McEdam, and today we're going to be talking about Sarah Jane Adventures Series 2 story, The Temptation of Sarah Jane Smith. Written by Gareth Roberts and is directed by Graham Harper. This is a sequel to whatever happened to Sarah Jane from the previous series, featuring the return of the trickster from that particular story, as well as the Grask. Now, unlike that story, which was a Sarah Jane Light adventure, with this story, with the Sarah Jane Light episode being taken up by the Mark of the Berserker, which leaves this story as not only a Sarah Jane-centric story, but it is mainly about her, and it's about her struggles and her environment. So this has the potential to be the best story within the series. Easily. It has all the gears are in place. It's a story which is a sequel to one of the best stories in the series, and it also features Sarah Jane now as a prominent character within the guidelines of the type of story whatever happened to Sarah Jane had set up the whole change in reality to fit a much more chaotic environment, because the trickster feeds off that, and our character's been tricked through some sort of time eddy, and so our characters have got to fix it right, but there's a core dilemma there. It's basically that premise. It's done 100 times in sci-fi before, especially Doctor Who. Doctor Who very loves this idea, this dynamic. Sarah Jane, of course, had one of the greatest scenes when it comes to this kind of storytelling, when it came to the story The Pyramid of Mars, where she has that scene in which the Doctor basically shows Sarah Jane what happens if they just left. Phenomenal scene. Highly recommend you that if you haven't seen that. It's on YouTube, or just buy Pyramid of Mars. It's a great story. You should highly recommend it. Comes from me. But anyway, so this story has a lot going for it, and I'm kind of surprised that's such a big event story, because this story has kind of been teased before. Something which I didn't mention in my Mark of the Berserker, because I didn't think it was relevant for that video in terms of just how much stuff I wanted to talk about it, is that story ends, literally the last frame of it is with Sarah Jane picking up a photo of her parents, which of course leads into this story. What I really like about it, and I think it handles the storyline in Series 2, is so great, and something which has really made me appreciate Sarah Jane over Doctor Who, of the revived series of Doctor Who, is that the story arc, please Doctor Who, listen to this, the story arc doesn't distract from the narrative it is telling. I'm going to have a go on a little rant before I get into the story, but in Mark of the Berserker, the story is about family and about how Clive and his manipulated and all that. And that last scene with Clive and Sarah Jane, when they're discussing families, and that Sarah Jane, she didn't know her parents, and she looks at that picture, not only ties us into this story, because this story, of course, will feature prominently Sarah Jane's family, but the scene works in that story. It's not like it just comes out of nowhere and it's like it's got to mention it so it can tease up for the finale, which again, this story is not the final story of the series. It's really, really bizarre. But that's not the only sort of connection, because there seems to be a whole idea of family within the series, with Luke basically talking about the fact that he wasn't really born in Secret of the Stars, and Sarah Jane has that kind of relationship, and she tells Luke at that point that her parents, oh no, that was Day of the Clowns, sorry. I think it was, I can't remember which story it was, Day of the Clowns or Secret of the Stars, but Sarah Jane does mention before that her parents died when she was a baby. And so there's lots of that with Day of the Clowns, of course. It features Rani, which is adding into the new big family, And the last Sontaran had Maria and Alan leaving, and it was all about their dynamic and how their family was breaking up from the Sarah Jane crew. So there's a whole idea of family in this story, which feels like it all complements into this narrative, because this is heavily focused on family, specifically Sarah Jane. And this story has kind not been teased, apart with the exception of Mark of the Berserker, but the ideas of this story have been floating around in other stories, and it does not distract them stories. In fact, they complement each other. It's the ideas of characters having these ideas and these themes happen so recently makes this story much more impactful, and that is how you build a series. Don't bring up words or a person and just have them like appear, and then it's just like, oh, what's this? You'll have to find out in the last episode. Sorry, bit of a tangent. I'll get off that dead horse now. I've beaten it around the bush. But yeah, anyway. This is a very popular story in the series. A lot of people consider it one of the best stories of Series 2. And that it is like easily one of the greatest Sarah Jane adventures. This series has a lot of like everyone's favourites, from what I can gather. Doesn't seem to be a dull episode in this series. So that is some really cool stuff, and very if you're looking into getting into Sarah Jane, I maybe recommend going into this first than Series 1, maybe. I don't know. I think this series has definitely a better quality overall. But Temptation of Sarah Jane, does it hold up? Does it work? Let's find out. The pre-credit sequence sees Sarah Jane and the crew basically chasing this small boy who has been placed out of time. He is originally from the 1950s. However, he had walked into a time etty, I think it's a time etty, which is obviously a reference to classic Doctor Who. I think it's what's the one with Peter Davison? Reservations of the Daleks? Revolution of the Daleks. I can't remember. R of the Daleks. The one with the Fifth Doctor. And so the Sarah Jane team are trying to like catch this boy, and right off the bat, I had flashbacks to the start of Ghost Machine from Torchwood's first series. It feels the way the story is cut, it's edited, it's paced, it's shot, feels very similar to that. I don't know if that was the idea or if it's just purely coincidence. I'm going to guess purely coincidence. But I had that flashback. And so they find the boy and they're basically right, sorry this is all a bit weird, but you'll be going home now. We'll send you back into the time eddy. And the boy is kind of scared, he's kind of nervous. And so Sarah Jane basically helps him by going in with him to say that, the time eddy is safe. You can go through it. And so she goes in it with him to find that the eddy takes her to a nice field by a nearby village back in the 1950s. And she before she leaves, she sees a tombstone, or like some sort of stone, which has a word that she recognises. She asks the boy what's the village nearby, and Sarah Jane recognises it. And this kind of puts this fear in her. And Sarah Jane's Elizabeth Sladen is easily a fantastic actress. We all know this. But the small beats of emotion that she has in this story are absolutely phenomenal. And Graham Harper, he really knows how to direct Sarah Jane. He really gives Elizabeth Sladen so much passion into it, and Elizabeth Sladen just like you could see the turning in her head, and I love how she kind of rationalizes herself. It's like, no, this is most likely a trick, and I've been with the Doctor for so many years. I cannot just go back, completely forget this ever happened. And so she goes through the time Etty. The small boy is talking to himself and is just like, my mission, did it work? He's seemingly talking to himself, but it turns out he is talking to none other than the trickster, who makes a return here, and that leads into the credit sequence. A very decent pre-credit sequence. We as a viewing audience at this moment, I mean, obviously if you saw the Next Time trailer from Mark of the Berserker, the mystery is kind of, thing, but going into this story not knowing what the story's about, because I don't watch the Next Time trailers, because of course I'm going to watch it, why wouldn't I? There is that kind of mystery, like what does this village mean to Sarah Jane? And it's not until she goes back home after she's clearly terrible at hiding her emotions. She goes very quiet with the rest of the crew. And even Luke, which we need to talk about Luke in this story. Tommy Knight's performance seems vastly different to what he's been playing for the majority of the series of Sarah Jane. Gone is, he's still Luke after all. He still has this very robotic kind of way of speaking, very logical sense, essentially a kid Spock, if you will. But here, seemingly out of nowhere, he's a lot more quirky. He cracks a lot of smiles and some little jokes, and seems genuinely enthusiastic about certain stuff. It's strange. It does kind of feel very strange watching them back to back to back. It feels like Tommy Knight is kind of playing a different character. He's still playing the same character, but like there's a few stories missing where he's much more human now than he was previously, which is kind of strange, but I think it's really for the better, because it means that Tommy Knight now has a lot more to show off in terms of him as a performer, as an actor. And I know a lot of people criticise his performance, but I think that was mainly to do with the character, the more logical character that he is, that he has to portray. I think in terms of emotion and character beats, there's nothing really you can do that for a majority of stuff. Although some scenes, which I have previously mentioned, have made me emotionally attached to Luke. But Tommy Knight has always had this struggle when it comes to his character. And although I still think it's there, I think that this story and the sudden charisma that Luke has suddenly got, I think it has helped his performance somewhat. I don't know the behind the scenes, whether it was Tommy Knight, whether it was Gareth Roberts and Russell T Davies and Phil Ford, or if it was Graham Harper, but his performance is different. It's noticeably different, and for the better in my opinion. And so when they get back to the house, Luke is like, "Mum, what's wrong? Clearly something is bothering you." And she tells Luke this story of her parents, and they died. She grew up with her aunt Vanetta from K9 and Company. But anyway, Sarah Jane's parents, she's been told, are lovely, most happy, most well-respected people, and would have been amazing parents. They were amazing parents to Sarah Jane as a baby, but they died in a car crash where their car hit a van, and Sarah Jane as a baby was left in a buggy all by herself. They seemingly have abandoned her just before they were killed. And Sarah Jane, there's this really heartbreaking scene, which I'm kind of surprised made it into a CBeebies program, in which Sarah Jane is like, I was constantly growing up of of being told that my parents were amazing, but I always wondered why, if they left their baby like that, they couldn't have been that great, couldn't they? And that kind of this emotional grip into her head that, you know, there's this mystery about her parents and she can find answers, but she knows that she would be tempted to change it so they will live, and that going there would be such a stupid idea. And she's learned with the doctor, you know, there's fixed points. You cannot change things you can't change things for the better when they're fixed points, because it can only just make things A, worse, or B, you know, with the doctor it's a lot more complicated. And I like how Luke is the one that tries to convince her, because Luke is very, you know, he cares for his mother, he loves his mother to bits, and in his point of view, he can do no wrong. Luke is also very logical. So, when he sees that this is upsetting his mother and sees that this is kind of something that's been bugging her all her life, he, without a second thought, is like, you should go into the portal. You should go in and meet them. You know, we'll just be there and back. You know it's wrong to change history. You learned this with the doctor. You know what to do. You are basically the best time traveler expert that I know, and I'm like a really smart person. So you have nothing to worry. You should go and meet your parents. Speak to them. Maybe they're lovely people. Only for a few seconds, and then come back. And I love that. I was kind of really worried when this was brought up, because, like I said, Luke is acting very strange in this story in terms of his performance. Not bad, but it's, again, like I said, it's different to what he usually is portrayed. And I was kind of getting this feeling that Luke was some sort of influenced by the trickster, like the boy is earlier on in the episode. But that never happened, and I'm actually incredibly grateful that that didn't happen. Maybe there was a deleted scene where Luke was revealed to be mind controlled by the trickster to try and tempt Sarah Jane more. Maybe. But it's not in the actual episode, and I'm glad it isn't, because it means that what Luke tells Sarah Jane, he actually means it and feels it. And it just says a lot more about their relationship and their identity as a mother and a son than it does than if he was mind controlled and it was, ha ha ha, Sarah Jane, we tricked you. So anyway, Sarah Jane, and she kind of thinks about it. She doesn't tell Luke to begin with, and she kind of puts on this 1940s dress, which I just want to say, I know I'm not the kind of person that like judges people on opinion, their appearances and stuff, but Elizabeth Sladen rocking that 50s look, she is absolutely gorgeous in this story. Just amazingly, you know, that was one of my favourite Sarah Jane costumes, to be honest. And so they go into the little village and get transported, not realising, of course, the trickster's influence. Now, Clyde gets worried because in the next morning, after something happened with the Time Eddy, where Luke is basically trapped, they're kind of trapped. Sarah Jane basically explains that she can get back, but it'll take a bit of time, so they stay there a little bit longer. And Clive wakes up the next morning and he doesn't know, because Luke was supposed to meet them up and they didn't, and so he goes to Rani. I keep calling her the Rani. That's the time lady, Rani, and they go into Sarah Jane's basement, and they see that the cube that was previously seen in whatever happened to Sarah Jane is acting up. It seems to be flashing some sort of blue light, indicating that there is something wrong with the timeline, or something drastic is going to happen revolving around changing in the timeline as Clyde has to explain to Rani, as of course she wasn't in whatever happened to Sarah Jane. That was before her time. This means that this story does have a back and around storytelling where we have the A plot, which is Sarah Jane meeting her parents and being influenced by all this, and then we have Clyde and Rani. Now, I feel like for part one, Clyde's and Rani's plot line is kind of dull but necessary, because in terms of character and as a viewing audience who are not familiar with the previous series, it makes it great for Clive to basically explain what happened in the last story. But me personally, who not only has seen whatever happened to Sarah Jane, but watched it quite recently for the marathon, only a few handful of stories prior to this, it does mean that a lot of that story, when it comes to Clyde and Rani, is just really going through details that I already know. And it means that they are not as strong as they usually are. And that's completely fine. You can't have every story focused on every character. Sometimes some characters are going to be backbenched to make other characters prominent. But I'm just stating that Rani and Clive become basically the backbenchers to this storyline. And so Sarah Jane meets her parents, and I love the gag where, of course, she can't tell them her real name, so she gives her name as Victoria Beckham, and Luke plays along with it by calling himself David Beckham. That's a football joke. I'm not a football person, but as someone who lives in Britain, football is bloody everywhere. And Luke kind of seems like the kind of person who'd like football, so that joke was kind of amusing. And because of course, in the 1950s, nobody knew who David Beckham was, so it does kind of work. And then we got this scene in which Sarah Jane sees the baby, and you might have noticed something right away. A character going back in time to their parents when they were a baby and try and stop their deaths from occurring because it will change the timeline, and they fix the thing and the time gets distorted. Doesn't that sound really familiar? It's Sarah Jane Adventures doing the Doctor Who story Father's Day from Series 1. It's essentially the exact same plot. And when you kind of realise that, it is kind of degrading in a sense, because it does, when you realise that this story has done something which, a lot of time travel stories have played with this idea, but Doctor Who has done it, not recently, when this story came out, which I believe it was in 2009 or 2008. I think it was 2008 this series came out, so that was like four years since 2005, since Father's Day, so it wasn't prominent in kids' minds, but as somebody who is very familiar with Father's Day, when you realise what this story is doing, you do kind of realise that this story isn't doing much original content. A lot of the plot lines it does have been done before, and let's be honest, done better. In fact, Sarah Jane, she meets her parents and finds that they are really, really lovely people, and the clicks in her brain, the trap has been set. She basically has a sit down, and she's kind of like, right, I need to get back home now. And Luke, after chasing around that boy and picking up a newspaper, goes to Sarah Jane and is like, right, we've got to get back now. It's too dangerous now for us to stay in this time period. Only for Sarah Jane to learn that it isn't July, as she was previously believed. It was August In fact, it's the exact day her parents were to die, and that sorry, there's a fly in the house. I don't know if you caught that. It was kind of like there on the screen. Anyway, I completely lost where I was. God damn it. The fly, the storyline then is like Sarah Jane, she basically realizes she's at the day her parents died. In fact, she even finds the car that they go in where they have that crash. And she kind of has this like little breakdown where it's like, I've saved the universe for complete strangers and I've put so much on the line to help others. Maybe this is the one time. Why does it have to be a trap? Maybe this is a good thing. Maybe this is an opportunity for me to save my parents. It's not like he's going to grow up to become a very important person. There's nothing in the grand scheme of things which will affect stuff. Luke obviously is like, what if you never met the Doctor because they were alive? What if all those adventures you had with the Doctor just never happened anymore? But Sarah Jane, she's kind of like, right, I know it's wrong, and she spends the entire episode like realizing that she's in the wrong. But she knows that she cannot just let people die. She is just way too kind-hearted, and so she breaks the car with her sonic lipstick. Her parents can now no longer drive the car and no longer go into that crash. This means that the timeline has been altered to the point where her parents have now survived. And we get this phenomenal shot of Clive and Ronnie, who have been chased by the Grask, who returns in this story. The same Grask that appeared in Whatever Happened to Sarah Jane, who gets a prominent role in part 2. Where the timelines get altered to the point where the entire Earth is a complete wasteland, just covered in rock and dirt. And Clive looks out and you can see Big Ben like crashed into the ground, and like it's a massive like dystopia scene. This place that they filmed this looks like the outside of the Satan pit. I could be wrong, but it does have that look to it, and this gives this story a much different look to most Sarah Jane adventures that we've seen, with this story having a much more grittier look. And that's basically part 1, with the cliffhanger being that Sarah Jane learns that the trickster is involved, and it's like, this is my trap. We have altered the timelines, and that your parents coming to life was such a break in the timeline that I can actually manifest myself into reality. This is the trickster in flesh and bone, who is now basically the ruler of the earth to a descent, as the Grask controls what's left of the humans, which are essentially slaves of misery and sense. So that's really cliffhanger part 1. And part 1, with the exception of the Clive and Rani stuff, it holds itself really well. But part 2, we'll get into it, but it still holds up really well with Sarah Jane is like, holy hell, I know, okay, this is really bad, but it's not too bad. I can just go back in time and fix the car, and all the timelines will be sorted. And so she and Luke head back, but she's gonna have to let her parents die, and she realizes that she does kind of realize that she's too kind-hearted to let someone die. She cannot do it. She cannot just let someone die. I mean, it's different in Whatever Happened to Sarah Jane, because she's trying to convince someone to basically reverse time so that they died instead of Sarah Jane. But here she would actively have to essentially kill her parents because she knows what she's sending them into. And Sarah Jane just can't. Now I realise I've talked a lot about part 1, and my little rant means that I'm not going to have a lot of time to talk about part 2. So let's just summarise for the most part. Sarah Jane basically has this story arc here of trying to be like, she's messed up, she's going to try and fix things, but she can't just let people to her death. There's a absolutely hilarious scene in which Sarah Jane is just like, there's only one person who know what to do, and he's never around when you need him. And she turns around, and you see what she's looking at something off screen, and she's like, it can't be. The coincidence of that. That is amazing. And we see what she's looking at, and it is a TARDIS, a blue police box. And she runs up to the door. It's like, Doctor, it's me. I need your help. Only for the door to open and to see a policeman through the door. It's not a TARDIS. It is just an ordinary police box. That was really funny. And to see a police box in Sarah Jane in this like really corny looking, because it's a much more accurate looking police box. That was kind of funny. That was really good. Fun fact, which blew my brains out when I did my research for this. The policeman is played by the milkman at the start of Stolen Earth. They're the same guy. That's kind of... that blew my head off. And so, yeah, that's mainly like her plot line. In the future plot line with Clyde and Rani, they basically have now something interesting to do. They explore this dystopian world where everything is just miserable. Rani actually sees her mother as a slave, and that they basically realize that the Grask won't really talk to him because they have this box and he's kind of scared of them. And so it allows them to talk to Rani's mother, and she is just really distorted, and she tells the story. It's like, we all know how this happened, how the world was destroyed. It was because of that woman, Sarah Jane. And she basically explains like how the trickster was formed because Sarah Jane, basically she brought the trickster into the world, and it has something to do with stone. I think they said it's an abbot or something, and so they basically try and reason with the Grask to help them, and we kind of get like a backstory to the Grask and how he was tricked by the trickster to work for him, and it turns out he's not really a bad guy. I mean, he's a very selfish character, and he wants to be like in control and stuff, but at the moment, in terms of like what he's doing within the stories, it's not really him. He's basically forced to work under the influence of the trickster. And we even have a flashback, and Jimmy V, I believe his name is, the guy who plays the Grask, does a fantastic job through the makeup of giving this scene a depth to him. I mean, it's only a little scene, but it's really nice to get a character who was just a henchman in a previous story, now getting a little bit more depth. And he then basically agrees with Rani and Clyde to help, but only one of them can go through. One of them has to stay behind, and Clyde basically offers himself. And this kind of means that Clyde becomes a complete non-entity in the final half of part 2, but he kind of had an entire episode to himself, story to himself in Mark of the Berserker. So you have that, and Rani basically explains, goes back in time. We get a scene in which she basically tries to find Sarah Jane by asking the locals, which they all stare at her and are like strange because of her ethnicity. There is this kind of joke which I don't know if it's aged well. I will admit I did kind of chuckle, but then I was like, I don't know if it's appropriate or not, in which, because, she's wearing like modern clothing, and one of the characters asks, that can't be the fashion in the Punjab. But I guess it's more, I laughed more of the fact that they mentioned the Punjab, an Indian country, which actually becomes a setting in a 13th Doctor story, The Demons of the Punjab. So that was kind of like a cool like pre-reference, I guess you can call it. So that's the main reason I chuckled. But anyway, so Rani basically tracks down Sarah Jane with accidentally revealing that the woman that Sarah Jane's parents were talking to her name is Sarah Jane, and the father is kind of like, why are you calling her Sarah Jane? And Sarah Jane's mother gets, sorry, my cat is going nuts outside. Let's just finish this off. Sarah Jane basically learns Rani's returned here, and Sarah Jane's parents do kind of click together that this woman is Sarah Jane, and there's this like weather storm as the trickster is forming and is coming to life and is going to destroy the world. And Sarah Jane is like, she goes into where the car is parked and she fixes the car, and basically Luke is like, okay, now we just got to get your parents in the car and tell them to drive. And Sarah Jane is just like, that would mean then me basically sending my parents to their deaths. I cannot do that. The trickster has beaten me. Which leads into this really sad emotional beat. It is kind of annoying that the fact that literally seconds later the parents arrive and they're basically like, we know what we have to do, we are going to have to, we realise we've got to get in our car and something bad's going to happen to us, but it'll save everyone here, including you, and you're Sarah Jane, aren't you? I wish that scene played with Sarah Jane basically realising that she's beaten, she cannot send her parents to their deaths. I wish that was played a little bit more. And with the idea of the parents basically going to their deaths, I hate to compare it to Father's Day, but Father's Day did it so much better with the Rose Tyler's father slowly realizing what's happening and then slowly basically like coming to terms with it and the emotional hook. And I did it in one episode. This is a two-parter. It has no excuse, really. But in here, the parents kind of really quickly, they don't even really realize that they're going to die, I think. I mean, I guess they realize that something really bad is going to happen. Maybe it's clicked together, but we never get a scene where they know that they died. There's a really strange scene which I felt completely was unnecessary and was very just strange and odd, where everything they touch decays, the parents, and Sarah Jane's mother basically just realizes it out of nowhere, like what is happening. It's really strange and very odd, and I don't understand what the hell is going on. But anyway, and this basically foils the trickster's plan, because he knew that Sarah Jane was just way too kind-hearted to let her parents die. But he was not expecting her parents to basically be like, right, we know what we're going to do and we are going to do it. Which basically poisons the trickster so that he is back as a non-entity within true existence. Which leaves our characters to then go into the present day, go back future in time, and have a happy ending. So that is The Temptation of Sarah Jane. Overall, it's a really good story. Don't get me wrong. It plays with some really great ideas, some really great themes, and is emotionally satisfying and emotionally hooked. especially if you are into Sarah Jane as a character. And Luke's sudden character change, or I'll say character change, performance change, I should say, does really help. But it's playing with ideas that have been done before and been done a lot better, in my opinion. And I feel like the fact that I've seen this before and the fact I've seen it done better in a shorter time as well means that this story kind of feels redundant in a sense. And it is nowhere near as good as whatever happened to Sarah Jane. That's my opinion. But The Temptation was really good, really great story, highly recommended. Just go in, realise that this story has been done to death before. Really, I only really recommend this if you're really into the character of Sarah Jane, like moi. So that's Temptation of Sarah Jane. So join me next time where the Sarah Jane Adventure team have to combat with Luke's real parents. The Bane are returned, and Sarah Jane needs help. She needs help from an old friend. So see you next time for Enemy of the Bane, and I'll see you next time for the last appearance of Brigadier Alistair Lethbridge Stewart. And I'll see you next time on the Doctor Who Marathon. Ta-da!